I've been looking forward to this ever since I was asked if I would. Of course I would. When I spoke to Jim, because we're allowed to call him Jim yesterday, I said, for me it's like meeting Elvis. And he said, don't be silly. But it is. When you've read the thoughts of somebody for so long, and they've informed what you think, even if you think they're wrong, it's fabulous. And it's fabulous that he's here. So would you please give an enormously rousing welcome to Jim Lovelock. I told you there'd be a huge applause, Jim.
Well, you couldn't have been huger.
No, wonderful. I was just been looking back at your past successes. When the first book came out, have you changed your mind? Were you wrong?
That's an interesting question, David. Wrong about what?
Yeah. Well, wrong about... You see, parts of it I interpreted at the time as being quite pessimistic. And you don't seem to be pessimistic anymore.
I don't think I've ever been a pessimist, but I think that being an optimist means being a realist. It's not much point having false ideas. Then you've got every reason to be a pessimist. You'll have them thrown down.
But for instance, if we just take one of the headline things, like the warming, the global warming, sure. It hasn't actually happened as predicted, has it?
No, it hasn't. And it's very interesting because most of us in the, what you might call the earth science game, climate science as well, and I was one of them, I think made quite a big mistake. We were wonderfully impressed with all of the data that had been gathered by Russian and French scientists in Antarctica. They buried down into the ice and got a wonderful picture of the atmosphere and the climate all of those years, practically going back for 1 million years and through a whole series of ice ages and warm periods and everything. And we all thought we knew how carbon dioxide in the air and climate were related. You could almost plot a perfect linear graph. Everything was the same. And we knew that it would be going up, the CO2. In fact, it had gone up quite a lot by the time the IPCC was first founded, about 1999, I think it was it, or 1998, somewhere around about then. You could say, well, if it goes on at this rate, it'll be so hot in such and such a time. The problem was, and the big mistake we all made, was not to realize that the world, during the ice ages, the atmosphere was clean. There was no pollution. There were hardly any people around. We weren't doing anything harmful. And so that was the clean world atmosphere. The atmosphere for the last 100 years or so has been growing progressively dirtier and dirtier all the time. So the rules didn't apply. Some things made it warmer, like carbon dioxide, but other things, like the haze that you can see in the air even today, reflect sunlight back and make it cooler. And it hasn't, one of the many reasons why it hasn't warmed as much as we thought was that the haze has grown thicker everywhere.
And what causes the haze?
Burning fuel, just the same as produces the CO2. The sulfur in the fuel, among other things, forms a haze in the atmosphere when it gets into it. Forms droplets of sulfuric acid that attracts water.
Now, in the 1960s, when you came up with the idea of Gaia, that our planet is self-regulating, are you still sure that that is so?
Oh, I would say a scientist can't be certain about anything. That's one of the creeds all good scientists have. You can never be absolutely certain about anything. It's all a matter of probabilities. I would say about probabilities, about Gaia, they've steadily increased. I think it's almost certain that the planet self-regulates.
Now, can you give us for instance, I mean, is it proof of that the level of oxygen remains at 21%, say?
The way to think of it is what would happen if it didn't. It wouldn't matter an awful lot if it was a bit less than 21%. You could drop it to 13%. In fact, I experienced that during World War II. One of the odd jobs I had was I'd worked, young man, for the Medical Research Council, and everybody was worried there would be huge epidemics of influenza as a result of people being densely packed in the underground shelters beneath London when the Blitz was on. And we went down there taking bacterial samples. To our amazement, we found the oxygen had fallen to 13% in the atmosphere. Everybody was breathing all right, but they were complaining bitterly because they couldn't light their cigarettes. You could strike the match, but the match went out instantly. The pyrotechnic part of the match burnt, but the wood wouldn't.
So we're all right as far as oxygen is concerned?
Yes, but no, we're not. If it went up to 21, from 21 to 22%, then all hell would get let loose.
Just 1% change?
Yes, because the probability of fire goes up nearly 100% if you increase oxygen 1%. And this would put forests all around the world under considerable hazard. At 25%, there'd be no forests. Everything burnt away.
And is this 21% figure then, is that the optimal figure?
It's the figure that it's stabilised at. I don't say it's not necessarily optimal, but the system has settled on that as a practical figure. If it pushes it up any more, then there's trouble. And organisms are selected that tend to keep it at that level.
When I was at school and I learned about evolution, I learned that organisms evolve that suit the environment. You are suggesting it could be the other way around.
A bit of both is the way. It's a system. Both the organisms and the environment are deeply involved in the regulation of the earth.
So they conspire?
Yeah, if you like. But they don't get together and hold a meeting on the top of the mountain.
Okay. We might come back to that. One of the things that used to worry me in my extreme youth, and I wrote a song about it, a protest song, which I thought was going to be a hit in the manner of Bob Dylan, but it wasn't. But it was about population growth.
Yeah.
Because I just climbed Helvellyn and thought it was beautiful, and I thought one of the lines was they're going to build housing estates on Helvellyn. And have you ever worried in your time as a scientist about population? Intensely.
Not so much about population as what it does. You see, when I was an adolescent in England as a child, I cycled from our home in Kent down to Land's End and back again. A lovely journey, staying at youth hostels and whatnot. I suppose I was about 16 then. And you've no idea how glorious the countryside was. It was one enormous carpet with villages in between, spread all the way across. There were hardly any cars on the roads to be seen at all. They were more of a kind of strange things to put wonder about. But I don't think the change that has followed of a sort of car-owning civilization and arterial roads has really done a lot to improve it.
But there are a hell of a lot more of us then. When you were born, what was the population?
Well, there was still an awful lot. There were 50 odd millions. I don't know the exact figure. I don't keep it very much in mind. But it hasn't increased more than about 20 or 30%.
20 or 30%. When we were talking yesterday, and in the new book, A Rough Ride to the Future, you point out that more and more of us are accreting in cities.
That's right.
I mean, would it be fair to make an analogy with the way that insects accrete in ant hills and things? Because it looks like that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because in a way, You know, scientists build models of things using algebraic expressions and all sorts, and they build up a model of how it works. Well, I think a much better way to do it is to use insects. I mean, they're like cellular automata that the scientists use to build their models with, but they do it of their own free will and in response to changes in the environment. And I think it's not surprising that insects have found that the best way of living is to live in nests. And you get the extreme case of the termites in Australia that even have nests with a huge air conditioning towers on the top of them to keep the internal climate just right for them. And so, no, I think our move to cities is a great idea. And when people talk about they want to save the planet, I get very depressed, because I think this is entirely the wrong way to look at things. We can look after ourselves in cities quite easily and cheaply compared with trying to save the planet.
Yes, but Jim, hang on a minute. Isn't there a bit of double standard here? Where do you live?
I live on the edge of the sea.
Yes. Is the closest city some miles away?
Well, would you call Dorchester a city?
No.
Or Bridport?
But I mean, you choose to live in sort of, not isolation, but I mean, it's about as far from city life, but it's about as far from New York as you can get, isn't it? But I mean, what I'm saying
what's
is
that leading to?
Well, it's because surely quality of life comes into this.
Sure.
You know, quality of life up a skyscraper in Manhattan or Canary Wharf isn't what I aspire to, and I suggest that maybe it isn't to you either.
Well, yes, but, and the big but here, an awful lot of people think they were in heaven if they got a flat in a skyscraper in New York. I don't, because it suits me. Those very same people would think they were condemned to almost a prison sentence to live where Sandy and I live, on the beach.
I'm going to just, because we tend to think of scientists as somehow inhuman, but there's a wonderful story. You came here about 25 years ago, and your life was changed?
Oh, very much so. To Oxford, you mean? What
Yeah.
happened in Oxford?
What happened?
Yes. Well, I was 68 at that time, approaching 69, which I'd be in July that year. And it was the same time of year as this, more or less. And at Christ Church College, there was a gigantic meeting that was largely organised by my wife, Sandy, who's there in the front row. And I'd been invited to the meeting. I'd never met her before, as one of the guest speakers. There were strange collections. Carl Sagan was another one. Mother Teresa was another one. So it was a kind of pretty ecumenical gathering, if ever there was one. And it was a mixture of religious leaders and parliamentary leaders from all around the world. Very colourful. As you can imagine, Sandy was exceedingly busy organising the meeting. But somehow, I don't know, it was just a few moments of meeting, and we fell in love, just like that.
Is this how you remember it?
Yes, but before we actually met, I had read the first Gaia book, and I was convinced this was the most wonderful man in the world. So I just thought it helped me to look at things differently, and I think it did that for an awful lot of people.
Yes. So what was the first thing? Okay, so you meet. Did you speak to her or did she speak to you?
No, we fell into each other's arms and didn't say a word.
Honestly, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
Well,
And you went off into the moonlight.
More or less. No, there was the magic coach was waiting to take us back to the hotel, so we just went down and sat in the bus.
And how's it been?
Wonderful.
You see, that emotion, has science got anything to inform us about that?
Oh, I'm sure it has. I mean, there are people who get theses and degrees and things on falling in love and whatnot.
But you examine it?
I know it's not my subject. I am a subject, not my subject.
Right, that's just background. I just think it is charming. In this book, you talk about evolution and you say, starting in the 18th century, that evolution has accelerated by quite a large factor.
Since the 18th, yes. It's a very interesting thing. If you think about it, the forerunner of the birds we see flying around now, seagulls and albatrosses and so on and so forth, was a feathered lizard. Somewhere way back, about 100 to 200 million years ago, which just made the first steps that gave it a slight advantage and enabled it to leave more progeny. And from that then on, Darwinian evolution led to birds, nice streamlined things. Well, it took about 100 million years between that first feathered thingamajig to an albatross or a seagull or a swallow. It took only 100 years to go from the Wright brothers string bag aeroplane to the sleek airliners you fly around the world in and take for granted nowadays. That is a heck of a rate of progress. It's a million times faster is the process of evolution now. And without our realizing it, we are gradually getting coupled in to the evolution of artifacts. I've got a pacemaker. It's part of, in a sense, it's almost part of my physiology now, and I'd be very uncomfortable without it. And
so you're bionic? You're bionic?
In a sense, the first steps, the very first steps, but it always moves on from first steps. And artifact evolution is so rapid that those first, I can foresee within 5 or 10 years, the people would be running around with pacemakers that don't have batteries. They'll just be running on your own system. They don't need a battery. The one I've got, the batteries have to be replaced every 10 years. Well, you might think I'm not ready. That's not too much of a bad prospect. If you're nearly 95, it's a long time to wait for a new battery. The new ones you won't need to. They'll run off you.
Okay, but you date, what do you call this area that we're in now? There's a word for it.
Oh, it's not my word. It was invented by an ecologist who worked in the Great Lakes in America, a man called Sturm, I think his name was. Sounds Scandinavian in origin. He called it the Anthropocene. It's a word I don't like very much. I don't like joining up those Latin and Greek origins to make scientific words. It's not so friendly, but that's what they call it anyway.
And because we are a major force in changing the environment.
Absolutely. I mean, haven't you ever wondered why it was the Romans didn't have iPads or cars or railways or telephones or indeed anything? They came to a grinding halt as far as their evolution of artifacts was concerned. The same is true of the Chinese and of almost every civilization there's been. They all came to a grinding halt.
Well, you see, I've had your book. I got it pre-publication, and I think I can answer the question.
Good. Oh.
Let me give the Lovelock answer that I think.
Yeah.
Isn't it because somebody near where you live, in Cornwall or something, found out that in the early 18th century that there was more energy in coal than there was in wood, and it could do work, and this was the beginning of the whole change?
Yes, more or less, David.
Is that
well, not so
50%?
But I think the key is need. Nobody invents anything unless somebody comes along and says, I do wish somebody would invent something. I have a need for this. And that's what stirs an inventor more than anything.
But you say the whole thing changed with the steam engine.
Sure.
Really.
Well, I'm sticking my neck out here scientifically in a big way, so, but I don't mind. Life can't start on a planet unless the star that's warming the planet is putting into it energy at a level which is roughly a kilowatt for every square metre of the planet's surface as seen from outside. And I think this is a rather critical in a way, if you look on life as an invention, it's a rather critical energy level. And once you pass that energy level, quite interesting things begin to happen. It's commonplace in physics that whenever you like a stream of air moving or of water flowing, once the flow and the energy in it gets beyond a certain new processes suddenly emerge that you wouldn't have expected. Well, I look on invention of the mechanical kind as one of those. And this chap in the blacksmith at Dartmouth in Devon, somebody said, I do wish somebody had invented a way of getting the water out of my mine. And he said, well, I think I could probably make something for you. And he made this steam engine that did the job. But the crux was that there was lots of coal lying around almost on the surface in Britain in those days. And he was able to use that to fire his boiler. And it produced enough energy to do the job of taking the... if he'd used wood, it probably wouldn't have been a bithy enough steam engine to do it.
So, okay, so is it Newcomen who
Yes.
did that? Once he starts that, is the iPad inevitable? Or is there another turning point?
I don't know, but I think in a way, the evidence suggests the iPad's inevitable, yes. And think of what, looking ahead, if the iPad came from that, what's coming from the iPad?
Yes, because you've got some pretty wacky thoughts about what the future of us as a species might be, haven't you?
Yes, I think we are the most important species on the planet at the moment. The one that came before us that was equally important, and well still is, was of course the photosynthesizers that took the energy from the sun and turned it into everything, turned it into food, to fuel, to the means of regulating the planet, all sorts of things. In other words, they were the transformers that took the sun's energy and turned it into everything else, the photosynthesizers. They eventually became the great trees, of course. They started off as single cells. We come along as an animal, not so different from any other animals around, but we've done something equally important. We took the information coming from the sun and used it to harvest, the energy coming from the sun and used it to harvest information, which is just as important as energy. It's one of the great quantities of the universe. Some physicists think the universe in the end will be found to be largely built from energy. Information.
Information. Okay, let me just take that, the concept of the photosynthesizers and information for a moment. Because one of the ideas that grabs you from the page of the new book is, I use an app for all sorts of things. We all use apps now.
Yeah.
But preceding by several billion years the App Store, you say that we have ancient apps in our bodies, and these circulated around the globe. Could you explain?
Yes, when you think about the first life that inhabited the Earth, right back at the beginning, we don't know the exact date or what form it was, except that it was almost certainly cells, and it would have been about 3.5 billion years ago, maybe a little earlier, maybe a bit later. I just don't know, but we'll find out in time. Now, those little organisms that grew like mad in the sea, and there wasn't much land surface but back in those times, but so they must have been mainly seaborne and near the surface. Like everything else, they evolved by natural selection. The ones that were most successful in producing progeny left. And they produced lots of tricks to make themselves more efficient. In fact, the most important trick of all, of course, is the one I mentioned, learning how to collect the sunlight and turn it into all sorts of other things. Because the food supply lying around at the start would be being used up all the time. You had to have that. Now, they had a thing very like the internet, because the tiny bits of DNA or RNA that form the information, the message about how to fix sunlight or something like that, are tiny things, and they can travel in the air as an aerosol. and they can travel around the world in 8 days. It's a bit slow compared with the internet, but considering how far back it was then, it wasn't bad going. And this way, whenever a new idea came along, they could exchange it with others of their relatives around the world.
And we still carry that message in our bodies.
We don't use it quite the same way, although someone might well say that the viruses that come along and infect us are doing the same kind of thing, although the messages they tend to bring are the ones we don't like.
Yeah. How much archaeology do we carry around with us? How much clue to the past do we carry?
I wish I knew, but it must be quite a lot.
And I say you have wacky ideas about our future. We quite enjoy being animals, don't we? We quite enjoy, we enjoy going out for dinner, we enjoy the whole...
Speak for yourself, David.
We enjoy the whole palaver of procreation,
Of course.
We're quite good at being animals. Do you foresee a time when we're not this wet, sticky, carbon-based thing and we're something else?
Not in any clear-cut manner. I think you've got to be very brave to predict very far into the future now. You see, this is an indication of how this Anthropocene effect has come in. If you lived in the year 1200, you could predict what it would be like in 1300 pretty well accurately. Yeah. And the same would be true in 1300. And so it would go on year after year. There would be big wars and plagues and famines and things, but nothing that hadn't happened before. But suddenly, when 1700 comes, things start getting trickier. It's harder to predict 18. By 18, it gets nearly impossible to predict. And I don't think anybody around about 1900 could have predicted 2000 and so on. Now, I wouldn't want to predict what 2100 will be like.
But all sorts of predictions surely aren't as reliable as they were. I mean, if you just turn on the weather forecast, the predictions used to be quite accurate. But you live near the sea, and you were saying, what was this February like?
Oh, it's wonderful. Exciting beyond belief. So there were, 5 hurricane-force storms in the course of the months. And you don't usually get more than about one in a year. And even then,
no, but you see, those of us, who read your early work, and that wasn't a prediction, was it?
What? There would be that?
There would be this instability in the atmosphere.
Not by me, but I think some of the good climate scientists have said one of the things that would happen in the atmosphere would get more unstable. And that's a way of looking at it, is more storms, more droughts, more violent events. That would be the main thing we'd be noticing. And up to a point, that's come true.
And if you put that information together with our wish to gather in groups in cities, if we do that, aren't we going to be wanting lots and lots of energy? Aren't we going to be energy deficient?
Not a bit of it, no, almost the opposite. You see, one of the dreams that I think many people have in England is a home in the countryside with a nice big garden.
Yeah.
And all well, that will use one hell of a lot of energy compared with flats in the city. You see, one of the things you may have worried about, and I did 10 or 12 years ago, was the thought that by the end of this century, the global temperatures would have risen about 5 or 6 degrees. How on earth will we manage then? What sort of living will we have? And it only occurred to me relatively recently that there is city life going on, not 5 or 6 degrees hotter than now, but 12.5 degrees hotter than now in the place called Singapore. That's their normal climate. And they live very comfortably. It's one of the most desirable cities in the world. Far from being in trouble, their main trouble is keeping people out of it. because they all want to go there and live there. And it's remarkably inexpensive to keep Singapore cool enough for the inhabitants, despite the fact that it's 12.5 degrees above the global average.
Okay, I'm continuing to worry. See if you can put me right on something else. I worry every time I get my electricity bill, every time I get my oil bill.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's disquieting, isn't it?
Well, that's politics. I mean, we spent the last 3 years, winter times, in America. The reason we were driven there, because the home we had before we moved to the beach was in Devonshire, was a rather large house, and it cost £6,000 a year to heat it, which was ridiculous. It only cost $600 in America, even though it was colder. But that's politics. There's nothing to do with energy balances or anything.
Do you find,
like that.
I mean, you're very nice about Mrs. Thatcher in your book because she was a trained scientist.
No, she was a Gaia fan. She was. She really was, and she was a sponsor of a small charity we founded called Gaia.
Yeah,
And
well,
I think that's almost the only thing she was a sponsor of.
yeah, well, fabulous. But in the main, do you find politicians are savvy on the sort of thing you talk about?
She was. She was. Don't forget, she was a scientist.
Yes.
She was trained here.
Mm.
In this university.
But putting her aside, do you find that in the main the political class are scientifically aware?
No, they're not. But they're not. We don't expect them to be. They're mostly lawyers, and this is their trade. And it's only right. They should be in many respects. They're our representatives. I think the main problem is not the politicians per se, but the civil servants. They ought to know better, and they don't.
You see, who do...
Because they advise the politicians on what to do and say.
Yes. You see, near me there's a perfectly reasonable set of fields that could grow crops, and somebody is putting photoelectric cells, solar cells, all over them. Now, it doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem right. Who do I get cross with?
I wish I knew who to put the blame on entirely. I would like to blame the Blair government way back in the, when was it? Not all that time ago, because with the renewables obligation and all of that kind of thing, a giant mistake. You're absolutely right. It's crazy to put solar cells across fields in this northern climate. The one time when we need electricity is the winter time, and
it doesn't do anything.
The sun is least evident. It's a silly thing to do, and we need that land to grow food on because we nearly died in World War II from lack of food. Not too many people of you will remember the rationing in those times. It was pretty rough. 2 ounces of meat a week, that kind of thing. And that was mainly because we were getting it still enough brought over in ships at great cost from America. If you have a world where increased population has reached a point where there isn't any food to send here, I think it would be very difficult to grow it on the fields, especially if you cover them up with solar cells instead of plants.
Another contentious thing that you've done is say that nuclear energy is a good idea. People get very cross with you for that.
I think less people than you realise. I think that again was I'd love to know who pays all the money to spread anti-nuclear propaganda around. Because somebody, you know, that old legal saying, cui bono, who benefits? Somebody must be benefiting from all that, because it's quite incredible the amount of anti-nuclear stuff that continuously is spread around, and yet it's the safest industry there is. It's
so
by
say
far
that
the
again.
safest
It's the safest
power industry we have. Even windmills are more dangerous than nuclear power stations.
Oh, come on, Jim.
No, it's true.
How can a windmill be dangerous?
People fall off them, or one of the blades spins through the air and lands on somebody's house and decapitates them. There's lots of ways you can be killed by a wind turbine.
But your idyllic place near Chesil Beach, if they built a nuclear power station near you and wanted to bury the side of the material that's produced in a field near you, you wouldn't like that, would you?
No, I'd ask them to let me have it. I offered to take the full output of a nuclear power station at my home in Devonshire way long ago, because it's in such a waste not to use the heat there is still in it for free home heating.
Inside.
I mean that. I'm serious.
Yes, I know
I'm
you are.
not just making a joke either.
I was just going to say, inside the mechanically assisted heart of Jim Lovelock, are you a scientist or are you an inventor?
A bit of both, as we all are. I think this division of people into different professions and expertise is all very well for the job scene, but in reality, we have the potential to be almost anything. Some of us more so than others, some of us less so. But I think it's terribly important to find the thing you really can do well and spend your life doing that. There was a very great artist we had, Eric Gill, and the women in this room must forgive me because his remark was somewhat sexist, what he made. He said, the artist is not a special sort of man. Every man is a special sort of artist. But if you use the term man in a more generic way, more sort of non-sexist way, then he was saying the truth. That I think is it. And it's not only an artist, a scientist. Every man's a special sort of scientist, as rather than
do you,
every woman.
When you solve a problem, are you always aware where the answer has come from, or does your
never
never your
never.
brain surprises you?
Oh yes. I think this is true. Inventors don't know where their inventions come from. They may con people into saying they do, but in real life it just comes into your mind and you know how to do it, and you do it. And then you spend years and years and years explaining how you did it. I mean, patent agents and people that will come along and say, this is all very well, this invention, it doesn't make sense to me. And I'm not going to be able to get this patent fixed unless you can explain exactly how, and this is a curse. You hate patent agents.
Do you? Oh,
yeah.
Who else do you hate?
No, well, anybody who makes life more difficult.
Oh, right, okay. But if you go into a big lab and there's all that chrome and everything, you know, I'm sort of in awe that all the people who put it there and use it must know so much more than me. Is that where the wisdom lies, do you think?
Don't think so, no.
I thought you might say that.
No, things, you see, I think if you speak to an inventor who is half a scientist and half an inventor, as I am, you find you invent things without the slightest idea how it all happened, but it works. And then you employ scientific tests to prove that it does work as you hoped it would. And then awkward people like this patent agent come and say, yeah, but how does it work? And this, I find, can quite often take you as long as 6 or 7 years of really hard work to find out how, in fact, it does work, to explain it scientifically.
Now, one of the big messages that comes out of the new book is that you're ferociously independent, aren't you? You're ferociously independent. And you've had to close your lab. Why?
Oh, health and safety.
Now,
I invented, for the Greens, a device called the electron capture detector. It probably did more than any other single device to start the green movement going. It is incredibly sensitive. It will pick up mere smidgens of all the nasty things, all the carcinogens, all the nasty chemicals, but it ignores almost totally all the goodies. It's quite extraordinary. It's quite by chance that it works like this. Well, maybe not by chance, but that's what happens. Now, unfortunately, it contains a radioactive source. And gradually, the health and safety regulations regarding radioactivity have reached a point where I would never have been able to make it in the first place if I'd started now.
And I wonder if the same strictures had been applied to Darwin or Faraday, would they have been stymied too?
I think they probably would have, yes. That's Faraday, most certainly. I mean, once they realised what electricity could do, I mean, you could be electrocuted by it. I mean, you've got to stop working with that immediately.
You see, yours is a paean of praise to the independent scientists. There can't be many of you left, are there?
Not enough, nowhere near enough. It's become increasingly difficult. The barriers against doing science independently are very, very strict and difficult as the years go by. They get worse.
And do we still need the independent scientists?
You are the judges of that, not me. I just do it because that's the only way of living I know.
You've been doing this, and you're 94 now.
Mm.
When you look back, what are the inventions, the insights, what are you most proud of? You won the heart of a good woman by coming up with the Gaia idea. What else, or is that the pinnacle?
That's the pinnacle.
Is it?
Now, I'm not going to list the things that I wouldn't know anyway.
But
If other people know,
but
not me.
But didn't you help with the microwave oven?
Oh yes, but no, not really. The first patent on the microwave oven was filed by the American firm Raytheon way back, I think, in the late 1940s. But I think I was the first person to make and use one. I think they only made it because they thought it would be something to... Big firms like to have stocks of things that they can exploit when the time comes. We were doing weird experiments, which most of you would disapprove of, way back in the 1950s. I was working with some biologists who were freezing animals alive and then trying to bring them back to life. And they succeeded with hamsters. And there's a legend about this, that the first hamsters all came from a pair that were found frozen on the top of Mount Ararat. But anyway, I'll go into details on that. It's not very
So hang on a minute, you've got fast frozen hamsters.
That's right.
And you're trying to find a way of defrosting them.
Yeah, well, these biologists quite often in the old days used to be very cruel people. They revived these hamsters by putting red-hot spoons on their chests, which started their hearts beating faster than the other part of their body, which circulated blood around the skin, and that enabled them to revive. Now, I didn't like this one bit. I didn't want to be part of that game. So I thought, we can do it better than that. It's the need, you see. There's a need arose. And I first of all made for them a simple diathermy bit of equipment from some gear I bought in a shop in Lisle Street that evening in London. And the next day I took it into the lab and said, here you are, warm them up with this. And of course that did it beautifully. Not only that, the hamsters were in far better condition. They are with great big burns on their chests. Then I got ambitious. I thought, I'd love to play with a magnetron microwave generator. They're great fun. And such a nice idea that is. And I got some friends in the Navy, because they were classified in those days, to let me play with one. And I used it to make a microwave oven and cook my lunch for occasional.
So you were the first person to have a microwave cooked lunch?
It was very like a modern microwave oven. It had a box and a timer and a microwave generator and a thing you could control the amount of energy going into it.